But James chapter 4, as James writes this to these early believers, James being the pastor of that first church in Jerusalem, the overall theme or challenge that James is responding to is coming out of that old covenant, changing your way of thinking, your perspective, coming out of that old covenant and into this new thing that Jesus the Messiah has accomplished for us, the new covenant. And life in the church, life as the people of God now is very different than it was as the people of God before. Easter changed everything. Not just the death of Christ, but his burial, his resurrection, and his ascension back into heaven. It changed everything. And now we are no longer bound by those laws and the regulations of the Old Testament. Christ's sacrifice once for all has satisfied God's holy standard so we can be reconciled to him. And how we express that faith, although the nature of faith has not changed. Faith is still about believing God as he has revealed himself to us, acknowledging him as the one true God, confessing our dependence and our submission to him, our loyalty to him, confessing our sin against him. That has not changed. But how we express our faith has changed. And the people of God are no longer defined by that ethnic, geographic, social, economic group called Israel, where if you wanted to follow God before Christ, you had to go and become a part of Israel. That was the people of God. It is now global. And anybody, anywhere, at any time can become part of this global thing called the body of Christ, the church. And it is understandable that 15 years after Pentecost and all that stuff happened, the church is continuing to struggle to understand the full implications of what has happened because of Christ. And in James chapter 4, he's already talked about the struggle in relationships, submitting yourself to God, etc. In verse 13, and then in the first part of chapter 5, he is going to address the issue of expressing our faith in terms of wealth, in terms of financial management. And not whether or not we have a lot of money or a little bit of money, but our perspective on wealth and how that influences our understanding of where God is, our engagement with God, and our engagement with God's people. In chapter 4, starting at verse 13, James is going to talk about a perspective on wealth, and then in 2 weeks after Easter, we'll look at the first part of chapter 5, and he's going to talk about the management of wealth. So we'll leave that for a couple of weeks. But starting at verse 13, he says in chapter 4, "Now listen, you who say, 'Today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money.' Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, 'If it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that.' As it is, you boast and brag. All such boasting is evil. Anyone then who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it sins." This very much echoes what Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount. Consider the glory of Solomon. It's nothing like the lilies of the field. Consider the birds. They don't toil or work, and yet God provides for them. And I think what was happening in this context is there had grown into that early church a little bit of contaminated thinking that came from that ancient Jewish mindset. If we are going to be blessed of God, we need to earn that a little bit. And if we see God pouring out his blessing on us through financial or other forms of success, clearly we're right and other people are wrong. And with that kind of thinking naturally comes a form of arrogance. It is an arrogance. It feeds arrogance. It starts in arrogance and it feeds arrogance. But James pulls some interesting language here that it's hard to pick up in the English, and yet it carries a ton of weight. When it says in verse 13that we are going to carry on business, the Greek word is the word that we get Emporium from, like a general store where you would go and it sold a little bit of everything. But in the ancient culture, this is a word that carried some negative connotation with it. And Peter, who was James' friend, uses the very same word to talk about those who are greedy and extort through the faith. That's the word that Peter is using here. And I suspect, I wonder, and if, I'm sorry, James is using here, I wonder if in his mind, he's going back to that time when Jesus cleared the temple of the money changers and the people that were selling the various animals. I can't help but wonder if this isn't in the background as James writes these words. Because there were three ways of earning a living in ancient Israel. First, you could be a farmer. So you would plant your crops, you would harvest your crops, you would sell your crops, and you made your living. Second is you could be a tradesman, like Jesus was. You could be a carpenter, or you could be a mason, or whatever. But the third way, and the way that was considered to be a little bit questionable and not having a lot of integrity, was to be a trader. And a person who was a trader who bartered, took goods and commodities produced by other people and facilitated trading that to a third party and had a commission, and that's how they made their money. That's the school of words that this comes from. That today or tomorrow you say, we're going to go to another town, we're going to set up a trading business, and we are going to be successful and we'll make lots of money. And James doesn't just condemn the greed behind this, but he's condemning the presumption behind it. He says in verse 14, what do you even know what will happen tomorrow? Or why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are but a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Indeed, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or do that. So it's not just the business practice that James is criticizing here, but the attitude behind it, the arrogance behind it, that I am independent of God and I can make my own choices. But the presumption that these people had is the object of James' criticism. He says in verse 16, as it is, you boast and you brag, and all such boasting is evil. They were saying that this is what we're going to do, and we're going to throw on a little spice and say, in Jesus' name, or we're doing this for the kingdom, or whatever. We're going to present this as something we're doing for the sake of the church, but really, we're being presumptuous and we're just going to do this on our own. Then verse 17 becomes a bit of a head scratcher. Anyone then who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it sins. And what is the good that he's referring to? Sometimes this verse is referred to talk about sins of omission. That if you see a good thing you ought to do and you don't do it for you, it's the fact you didn't do it is sin. That I don't think is what James is talking about here. The good thing James is talking about is in contrast to that boasting or that presumption, and that is confessing in the community of faith our shared dependence upon God. So the good that we should do is, rather than say, I'm going to accomplish these things, tomorrow I'm going to do this, and we're going to make lots of money or accomplish whatever. He's using a specific example of money, but the idea is much broader. The good is expressing our faith out of an understanding of our shared interdependence on God, our confession of loyalty to God, our submission to His authority, and recognizing together as a community of faith that what happens as we work together and as we seek to represent Christ well is what God desires to have happen. So the good, anyone then who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it, the good is looking for, being sensitive to the reality of God's fingerprints and plans and purposes in every detail of our life. Failing to acknowledge that God is orchestrating, that God is accomplishing His purpose. Being presumptuous to say, we're going to do this today, and we're going to have this outcome tomorrow, is essentially saying, God, I can do this without you. The good thing, and James puts this in moral terms, the right thing to do is to say, by God's grace, by God's will, we are going to set out to accomplish this. But it is God that will accomplish it if it is what God has determined is His will, what He wants to have done. Now there's an Old Testament passage that speaks of this in Jeremiah chapter 9. I love this text. Thus says the Lord, let not the mighty man boast of his might. Let not a rich man boast of his riches. But let him who boasts boast of this. Sounds just like James chapter 4. That he understands and knows me. That I am the Lord, who exercises loving kindness, justice, and righteousness on earth, for I delight in these things. So the presumption is that if I have certain inputs into God by jumping through what I think are the things that will make God happy, and I push the faith buttons, therefore God is obligated to give me these anticipated outcomes, that's the presumption. Instead of that perspective, Jeremiah says, if you're going to boast in anything, boast in this, that you have a relationship with me, that you know me, that you know that I am the one who exercises loving kindness and justice and righteousness on the earth. Both, I think, in God's direct hand, but also through his servants, through you and I, as we stand for integrity and righteousness and justice and model loving kindness. For I delight in these things. What greater thing is there than having a vital, growing, ever deepening, maturing understanding of who God is, and an increased sensitivity to see his fingerprints, especially in the fog of life. That's why I chose Psalm 11 this morning. When David said, I'm being oppressed, and my counselors say to me, run away, go to the mountains, find your security in the mountains. And David says, no, because God is the creator of heaven and earth, and he is on his heavenly throne. The Lord is in his temple. That is the source of my security. And that's the source of our security. And yes, we need to plan. Yes, we need to be good stewards. God's given us responsibilities, but always with open hands that say, as the Lord wills.